why is it that of all the billions and billions of strange objects in the cosmos, novas, quasars, pulsars, black holes, you are without doubt the strangest? Slides 3, 4, and 5 in quick succession. This comes from the author, Walker Percy, whom, strangely, it seems no one, not even in the United States, where he's a prize-winning author, has actually ever heard of. Okay, and this comes from his book, a wonderful book of which I have 2 copies, neither of which I'm parting with, called Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. Great. It's extremely funny, witty, and indeed the kind of book that could have been written, in fact, by somebody like Percy French. So human beings are weird. And I don't mean just your relatives and friends, okay? Okay. I mean you. Okay. We have a tendency to see ourselves as normal, and the rest of the human beings, and indeed the rest of the cosmos, as somehow a bit strange. But the rest of creation is just fine, okay? It's we who are weird. We really are strange people. We're fascinated with ourselves. We talk to and about ourselves all the time, just as we're doing here today. Okay. Walker Percy suggests that if a Martian were to drop in to see us, what would be most obvious about us is that we spend most of our time in one kind of symbolic transaction or another, talking or listening, gossiping, reading books, writing books, making reports, listening to lectures, delivering lectures, telling jokes, looking at paintings, watching TV, going to movies. Our capacity for language and thought brings us into a new world, a brave new world perhaps, but a world that has both heights and depths. We live in a world filled with meaning, or not, as the case may be. Despair, ecstasy, and boredom become possible to creatures such as us, but you will search high and low to find the jealous pig, or a parrot suffering from existential angst. Okay? Dogs don't get bored, and cats just go to sleep when there's nothing to do. But a man in the world has the unique capacity for being delighted with the world and himself and his place in the world, or being bored with or anxious about it, or depressed. More significantly, our world is also a world of ought, where before there was no ought. It is a world characterized by morality, by words like should and must, not just a world of brute facts. We have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and once we have acquired knowledge of good and evil, there can be no return to Eden. For if there is an eye, namely me, there are other eyes, and they cannot be treated as merely things in the world. Now, not only are you strange, which I'm very happy to say, okay, but I am even stranger, okay, and strange even to myself. Even driving up this morning, I had one of those kind of existential moments as the rain, inevitable, after the heat wave of 2 days, dear God, 2 days of heat, what shall we do? Struck me, and it's just like, I was thinking, you don't pump your heart just pumps. You don't do anything about it. You can't really stop it or control it. Maybe for a yoga you can control it to some extent. Your breathing you can stop, but only for a limited space of time, after which your body reasserts itself. We're very strange beings. So the self is like a movie camera that sees but is not itself seen. You know, in a movie, if the camera tracks back, all that happens is you get a wider shot. You don't get the camera, unless it's an accident, in which case you see it in a mirror or in a window, reflected in a window and so on, but you don't see the camera. So we're like cameras. The self is invisible to itself, in fact, unspeakable to itself in many ways, and always the speaker, never the spoken about. And the self is not only unspeakable, but at times unbearable. It can and often does try to get rid of itself by means of distraction. Drink, drugs, sex, shopping, football matches, partying, and the like. On the slightly higher level, the same objective of getting rid of itself can be attained through immersion in music, in art, in literature, or even in science. But all things, good or bad, come to an end. And at the end, the self is inevitably left face to face with itself when the party is over, when the music stops, the game grinds to a halt, or the research project concludes. At that point, we come face to face with ourselves, and the question that won't go away confronts us. Who or what are we? Now, there's so much here of permanent interest, but my focus today is very limited. Rather than to arrive at conclusions, I also want to present you with some material for reflection. So the plan of my presentation is to consider as briefly as possible what I regard as the three main approaches to the question of what it is to be human. And I will follow what we can glean from these approaches, very superficially, I must say, because of the time constraints, to two current topics. One is transgenderism, and the other is something that Kevin adverted to already this morning, transhumanism. I want to talk about this very, very briefly, just in other words, to set the tone for a conversation. I should immediately say, by the way, that the topics of this presentation are controversial and controverted, and that in trying to give a synoptic overview, much detail is inevitably omitted. Could I have slide 6, please? This should read, I can't see what's on the screen, it should read, 3 positions that one can take. Is that the one? Okay, good. Okay. So, 3 positions you can take on the question of the soul or self and the body. One is soul, yes, body, question mark. Okay. The third one, skipping to the right, is body, yes, soul, question mark. And the other one is soul/body. So let's start, perversely, with position 3. Okay, work backwards. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Yuval Harari, slide 7 please, Francis Crick and many others believe that everything we do is governed by physical laws. Our brains are physical, and therefore they are also controlled by physical laws, just as every organ in our body is. Our thoughts are the result of physical cause and effect. We might think we control our thoughts and choose our actions, but that's an illusion. As Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of the double helix, put it, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Who you are is nothing but a pack of neurons. Okay, does that depress you? Could I have slide 8, please? Alex Rosenberg is another of that august company, and in his book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, Enjoying Life Without Illusions, he lays out his credo. Slide 9, please. Okay, I've summarized it here. There is no God. Reality is whatever physics says it is, nothing more. We do not have immortal souls, unless we're having free will. Well, forget about it. Why are we here? Well, why not? Okay, it's all just a matter of luck, good or bad, depending on your view of the universe. The universe has no purpose. The answer to the question of the meaning of life, the universe, and everything is that there is no answer, not even a number as charming and as intriguing as 42. All that happens when we die is that everything goes on as before, just without us. And it's not only life that has no meaning, your thoughts have no meaning either. Are you self-conscious? Well, don't be, but consciousness specializes in producing and supporting illusions. Perhaps the biggest and most persistent of which is that there is such a thing as a self to be conscious of. And finally, there's no significant difference between right and wrong, or between good and bad, and there is no reason whatsoever for you to be moral, except that it makes you feel better. If you weren't depressed before, now you should be really depressed. Okay. Of these 8 items, the ones that concern us today are, could I have slide 10 please? 2, 3, 6, and 7. Reality is what physics says it is, nothing more. We do not have immortal souls, your thoughts have no meaning, and there is no such thing as the self. Number 7, of course, is very important. According to Rosenberg, everything is or can be explained ultimately by physics. Everything. Physics explains chemistry, chemistry explains biology, and so on. But it should immediately be obvious that at least one thing is not explained by physics. And that's the very claim that physics fixes all the facts. That claim is not a claim within physics, but a claim about physics. It is, to use a term that Rosenberg would probably reject, a meta-physical claim. Slide 11, please. Science, says Rosenberg, reveals that reality is stranger than even many atheists recognize. Science gives us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about the nature of reality. Most fundamentally, it tells us that everything in the universe, including your thoughts, your beliefs, your very self, is simply the product of the interaction of fermions and bosons and happens as the result of pushes and pulls of bits of matter and fields of force. For Rosenberg, what appears to be your solid, enduring self is to repeat the product of, as I said, the interaction of fermions, bosons, and so on. It is, in a word, an illusion. Try telling that to the taxman when he comes around. In our everyday social world, our life world, we spontaneously attribute psychological states to ourselves and to others that appear to have content, to be about things, to be meaningful. We understand ourselves and others, sometimes, and our actions in terms of purposes and intentions. We believe things, we make claims that we think to be true, we praise and blame others for their actions, believing to be responsible for their actions, and so on. Is this a kind of primitive folk psychology corresponding to a kind of primitive folk physics? If so, is it also, like folk physics, fundamentally eliminable in a light of experimentation and a more complete theoretical knowledge? Well, thinkers of a Rosenbergian stripe consider the concepts constitutive of the world of our everyday experience of ourselves and others to be a kind of primitive scientific theory that can in principle be replaced by a more adequate theory, just as is the case with folk physics. But this cannot be. Certainly some aspects of our intuitive beliefs about ourselves are eliminable, but the whole structure of folk psychology, to use a somewhat pejorative term, is not eliminable. Let me explain very briefly why that is so. Slide 12, please. If our folk psychology were fundamentally eliminable, this would create an insuperable problem for us. For in order to make accepted or be persuaded of the truth of any account, including scientific accounts, we have to be able to reason, to think, and to accept freely the arguments and the evidence presented to us. But if the radically revisionary account of our everyday psychology were correct, there would be no such things as reasons, evidence, aboutness, and so on, just as Rosenberg asserts. And so the radically revisionary accounts themselves would become meaningless. Our understanding of who we are then, and what we do, is not merely a starting point to be abandoned when we arrive at a more adequate theory. It is the source and ground of all our theories, including our scientific theories. Just as Samson, in destroying the temple of the Philistines, brought it down upon himself, so too, if our scientific theories were to destroy the coherence of our life world, these very scientific theories would be destroyed by the very same process. Professor Rosenberg is not the only thinker to hold radically revisionary views on what is to be human. There is, in fact, something of a cottage industry for this. Okay, if I wanted to make some money, I should write a book along these lines, okay? Because apparently whatever you write on these lines gets published. Slide 13, please. Sam Harris, just like Rosenberg, appears to regard our life world as fundamentally illusory. But Harris himself is not just a complicated physical, chemical, biological system. He is a human being, and in his book, he asserts a definite position, that free will is an illusion, and he argues for it as a meaningful and indeed a truthful position. But if all we are is a physical, chemical, biological system, and free will is illusion, then our claims have no more meaning than the sighing of the wind in the trees, or the crashing of the waves upon the shore. And that, of course, applies to Harris's claims as well. So one has to wonder why Harris and Rosenberg and their confreres display such evangelical zeal to persuade us that free will is an illusion and that purpose and meaning are totally unreal. What is the point of such zeal? Why are they trying to persuade readers to believe what they say, given that if what they say is true, there can be no readers to persuade, nor any truth to persuade them of? Because for them, there is no truth in any metaphysical sense, and we don't choose our thoughts. It's hard to disagree with the philosopher Lynn Rudder Baker when she says, quote, "To deny the common sense conception of the mental is to abandon all our familiar resources for making sense of any claim, including the denial of the common sense conception. If the thesis denying the common sense conception is true, then the concepts of rational acceptability, assertion, cognitive error, even of truth or falsity, are called into question." So then the rejection by Rosenberg and Harris and others of free will, intentionality, purpose, and meaning has a kind of admirable, if lunatical, consistency. Consistency we would respect if they really were willing to pay the cost of living in a world devoid of such things. They may claim to think of themselves and others as if they were mere masses of cells without meaning, purpose, or significance. But this is just pretense. No non-pathologically disturbed person really thinks this about others, or indeed, and perhaps more especially, about themselves. When it comes right down to it, we don't judge people so much by what they say as by what they do. And Rosenberg, Harris, and company do exactly what the rest of us do, which is to live in a life world, a world they share with the great unwashed, a world of meaning, value, choice, and truth. That's position 3. I'm arguing it's fundamentally incoherent. Okay, that leaves us with 1 and 2. The great expositor of position 1, which was soul, question mark, body, soul, yes, body, question mark, right, is of course Plato, for whom the soul is you, right? It pre-existed your current incarnation. It will also post-exist it. The soul communicates its life to the body, is a subject of morality, and it is that which thinks. There is, of course, much more to the Platonic conception than this, notably his tripartite division of the soul and so on, but I haven't time for that today. By the way, and of course, it's position 1 that gives point to the title of this talk. What's a nice soul like you doing with a body like this? Okay. Plato's conception of the soul is not that of the ordinary Greek in the Agora, or indeed the Hebrew in the desert. Ordinary Greeks and Hebrews conceived of the soul as a shade existing miserably in a kind of living death. Better to be a beggar on earth than king of the underworld, they would say. Did Plato originate his conception of the soul himself, or did he absorb it from somewhere else? We can only speculate. It's true that he began his intellectual life as a Pythagorean and most probably ended it also as one. And there may well have been connections between the school of Pythagoras and the Vedic tradition of the Indian subcontinent. And the idea of reincarnation, which is obviously in Plato, certainly bears the mark of Pythagoreanism. The intellectual connections between the Platonic conception of the soul and the ordinary conception of the soul are not the only similarities. For Plato, the world of our ordinary experience is not fully real, being a reflection of or a participation in another order of being that doesn't possess the constant changeableness of this world. Similarly, for the Hindu tradition, could I have slide 14, please? Brahman, in the Vedic tradition, is the single inclusive non-personal reality of which all things and processes of the experienced world are so many parts. A reality which includes the world as it is, but is not exhausted by any manifestation or series of manifestations of the world. The Hindus have a slogan which says that Brahman extends beyond this world by this much. In other words, it's not fully exhausted. There's always something more. For Shankara, one of the 3 principal thinkers of Vedanta, one of the major schools of Vedic thought, all differences and distinctions are ultimately superficial and unreal. Reality is a single, all-inclusive, non-differentiated being. Everything else is an appearance of this. Slide 15, please. So too, Atman, the self or the soul, sometimes identified with Brahman, is without temporal origin. Okay, we have Samsara, which is the cycle of rebirths. We have karma, which is the principle of causal connectedness. We have moksha, which is the release or liberation from samsara. And we have dharma, which is the teaching relation to this. And the whole idea is that what you really are is this self or soul or Atman, which is ultimately part of Brahman, but somehow, as it were, isolated from it, as it were, temporarily and associated with the body. And the whole purpose, as it were, is to detach yourself completely from this, to end the cycle of reincarnation. All that said, there's a very distinctive difference between the way in which the soul-body distinction is drawn in the West and in the East. In the West, conscious states and mental processes are considered to be aspects of the soul, in contrast to bodily matters, whereas in Hindu thought, however, conscious states and mental processes are considered to be part of our bodily being. The contrast in Hindu thought is not between mind and body, but between pure subjectivity, which includes no mental content whatsoever, and everything else. Slide 16, please. So you can see here, I've said I've contrasted the West and the East, and I have soul, self along 2 columns, and you see that for the West, self or soul has conscious states and mental processes, whereas on the East, it's pure subjectivity or awareness, and the realm of nature in the West is material or physical reality, whereas the realm of the nature in the East is material reality and conscious states. If ever of you have any studied phenomenology or Husserl, you'll be aware of Husserl's distinction between what he called the transcendental ego and the empirical ego. The empirical ego is, in other words, what you're aware of at any particular time. In other words, it's the content of your thoughts, what you're thinking about, like, why did I come here today when I could have stayed home and had tea and toast or something like this, right? Whereas the transcendental ego is that pure subjectivity behind, which is never in focus. It's always the subject, never the object. And if you start to think about it as an object, then all you've done is pull the camera back, okay? And made your thinking, in other words, your thinking is now simply part of your empirical ego. You can never get away from it, as it were. You can never turn the camera on the subject. Anyway, whatever about the relations or non-relation between Indian thought and Platonic thought, the conception of soul common to both is that the soul or Atman is the self, and it prompts that question, which, as I said, I've given to this talk. What's a nice soul like you doing with a body like this? If what you really are is this self or soul, which is only contingently related to a body, we need an explanation. We need a story. Did you do something bad in a previous life? Was that what it was? And you got stuck with this body? If you continue to be the miserable person that you are, will you come back as a slug? Okay? Okay. All right? Anyway. But why is there any connection in the first place? Some answer must be given. There are answers, but I, for one, have never found them convincing. And so we come to position number 2. So if we reject a radical soul-body dualism, where then are we? Are we merely bodies of quite a high degree of complexity? Or can we take from the kind of dualism we saw in Plato and the Hindu tradition, leaving behind any admixture of error, can we take something from that? And that's what I believe Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition does, though I can't argue the point here in any detail. It posits that, slide 17 please, that the human being is a unity not of 2 substances, not of 2 things as it were, stuck together like a sandwich, but rather of 2 principles. One of which is matter, the body, which is organized, and form, or the soul, which is what organizes it. There's only one thing. Okay, that's the human being. But we can distinguish 2 principles within that. On this view of things, human beings are essentially embodied creatures. We're not just accidentally embodied. We are essentially embodied creatures. This is what we are meant to be. Our body is not some accidental appendage to my real self, but a real and necessary dimension of what I am. I'm going to try and see, the reason for my going, you might say, what has this got to do anything, right? Okay. And I'm going to try and take all of this, try to show you how these different ways of thinking apply to current issues. Things that are of concern to us right here and right now. These are not just historical things. I mean, as Kevin was saying earlier on, it's not like Percy French is just, something from the 19th century we can ignore. These things are permanent questions, and these are the possibilities that pertain to them. Anyway, where was I? So I'm not some accidental appendage, but a necessary dimension of what I am. The human being, we do not occupy our bodies, and the soul is not, as in Plato's image, like a sailor in a ship. A sailor can be in a ship, but it can get out of that ship and go into another ship, right? Our soul and our body are not related in that way. My soul then, but the soul and body are 2 dimensions of a single reality. Slide 18, please. As Aristotle pointed out long ago in the first book of his De Anima, which is strangely the Latin title, though he wrote in Greek, so in Greek it's Peripsychios. The problem with much of what his predecessors had written on the subject of the psyche, which is the soul, is that it made contingent the relationship between soul, psyche, and body, soma. Whereas for him, psyche and soma were 2 constitutive principles of a single reality. So the Aristotelian psychosomatic view then rejects the extreme or Platonic view. But is it right to reject extreme dualism? Might not the extreme dualistic understanding of the human person be right after all? Perhaps the person, the self, or the soul of the Atman is not the body, but only inhabits it and uses it as an instrument. Maybe the real person is the conscious and feeling itself. The psyche and the body is simply a material machine that our real self temporarily animates and in which it temporarily resides. Were the Gnostics or their latter-day followers right? Have we erroneously and unreflectively misconceived ourselves as being essentially bodily? Maybe the Gnostics are right in thinking that the body is a mere machine and the soul or self a kind of ghost that animates it. But if so, Gnosticism has to account for our seemingly ineradicable experience of ourselves as being essentially one, despite there being pathological circumstances in which we may, on occasion, feel ourselves to be divided into parts. And it has to account for the stubborn and unshiftable experience that our bodies, feeble and fallible as they may be, and as somebody who is now 71 and approaching the end of his life rapidly, thank God, okay, okay, and feeling the fallibility and the feebleness of the body. They are our bodies and an essential developed dimension of what we are, and not merely prosthetic devices like a mechanical leg or arm that we employ, but which is in principle detachable from us. Slide 19, please. It is one and the same person who thinks abstract thoughts and loves justice and disinterestedly desires the good of others. The one person who sees and hears and tastes and touches, who eats pizza and who takes up space on a bus. When things happen to my body, they happen to me. To reject extreme dualism, we appeal to experience, one aspect of which is our experience of ourselves as unities of parts, to be sure, but nonetheless unities. Could we be the victims of systematic illusion in this regard? It's possible, in the thinnest and most abstract sense of possibility. But this mere possibility, even if we had any positive experiences, think it true, and we don't, must be placed against the irrefragility of our experience. Robert George writes, "Nothing gives us reason to suppose that experience to be illusory. Even if body-self dualism could be made coherent," he's talking about the Platonic kind, which I doubt, "we would have no more reason to believe it than we have to suppose that we are now dreaming or stuck in the matrix." There are exponents of ontological dualism in Western thought today. Slide 20, please. But dualism is not the dominant position in the philosophy of mind. Not that that makes it false, of course, because philosophy, truth, is not a matter of fashion, what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. Okay. So now let me turn to take all of this nonsense I've just been talking about for a while, and let's see if we can apply it to two current problems. And the current problems I want to talk about are transgenderism and transhumanism. In regard to the first, I published a book just over a year ago called Hidden Agenda. Okay. Transgenderism's Struggle with Reality. Please buy it, read it. Well, actually buy it and read it. Or just buy it, even if you don't read it. Slide 21, please. At the root of gender dysphoria, which is, okay, anyway, at the root of this is an experience of a mismatch or lack of congruence between one's biological sex and one's inner sense of gender, whatever that may be. This incongruence is sometimes expressed as feeling like a man in a woman's body or a woman in a man's body. What are we to make of such claims? So let's try a thought experiment. Slide 22, please. What does it feel like to be a tree? Think about it seriously for a moment. No, think about it. It's wonderful. There's some lovely trees out here. What's it would be like to be a tree? How did you go about trying to answer this question? Right? Did you screw up your eyes like I just did and conjure up an image of a big oak standing alone in a field? Well, this is simply your remembering or imagining of what you experience when you see a tree, not what the tree experiences. Can literature help? What about the Ents in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings? Not much out there either. And if you're stumped, pun intended, to answer this question, I'm not surprised. You're not a tree. You cannot have a first-hand experience of what a tree feels like, if indeed it feels like anything. Next slide, please, slide 23. Now ask yourself, what does it feel like to be a dog, or if you wish to channel Thomas Nagel, to be a bat? Once again, no human has that experience and cannot have the requisite experiential knowledge. We can imagine what it would be like to be a tree or a dog or a bat. easier perhaps to imagine we're dogs or bats and trees. Things that we are in fact not, but we cannot have that experience. Take the bat's ability to navigate by means of sonar. We can understand how this works, right? But the bat isn't checking out signals on an internal mental video screen and making sophisticated mathematical calculations. It simply experiences the world as mediated by its sonar abilities, navigating its way around the world directly by sound, much as we do by sight. See, when you look out on the world, you don't have a mental computer in your head as a little screen and you see all of these signals coming in and then you complicated mathematical calculations to figure out what's going on. You simply see the world, right? The bat hears the world, right? Now, we cannot experience that. We can understand it. So, when a man says he feels like a woman, what does he mean? He isn't a woman, and he cannot have the actual experiences that a woman has. At most, he can rely on second-hand accounts from women of what it is like to be a woman, or else he may rely on culturally available stereotypes of femaleness and try to identify with these. But these accounts, or these stereotypes, however extensive and however refined, are not equivalent to actual experience. As Anderson notes, many feminists have pointed out, no biological male can really experience what it's like to be a woman, for males can have no embodied females' experiences. By parity of reasoning, by the way, no biological female can experience what it's like to be male. For females, similarly, can have no embodied male experiences. You don't know how lucky you are. Anyway, what does it mean to have an internal sense of gender? What does gender feel like? What does it mean to say you have a feeling of being a man in a woman's body or a feeling of being a woman in a man's body? These feelings, if they exist, and they do to some extent because there clearly is a psychological condition called gender dysphoria, are not like the feelings of being pinched, the feeling of a hot stove in your hand or the feeling of anxiety. How do you know that this feeling that you have is the feeling of being a man as opposed to being that of a woman? What are the criteria? What's the point of contrast? If we cannot even experience in all respects what it's like to be another individual of the same sex, as indeed we can't, still less can we know what it feels like to be a member of the other sex. Slide 25, please. And here's another question. Why should our feelings be determinative of reality? It's patently obvious, being attacked by a fly here, it's patently obvious that our feelings change and change frequently. Does our reality change correspondingly? There's a curiously ethereal aspect to transgenderism. Myself, you begin to see why this is familiar now, right? My real self is given to me by my feelings. I feel as if I were a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa. And my feelings are more real than any biological facts. Sometimes, however, transgender incongruence is expressed more radically. It's not so much being a feeling of being a man in a woman's body or vice versa, but a matter of being a man in a woman's body or vice versa. But just what would it mean to be a man in a woman's body or to be a woman in a man's body? For this even to begin to make sense, there would have to be, and this again now we'll come back to what I was talking about earlier, there would have to be a radical distinction between a me, which would be capable of being either a man or a woman, and my body. The relationship between these two entities would be contingent, just as in the first position, the Platonic position, right? So that this real me is in this male body, but could conceivably have been in a female body, or vice versa. Slide 26, please. But whatever else may be obscure about this position, and there's a lot that's obscure about it, one point should be obvious. If this is so, whatever the me is that is not my body, if it has the capacity to inform any living structure, including this or that male or female body, it cannot itself be either male or female. It cannot be either one. If it has the capacity to be both, depending on circumstances, it can't be either one. And what would make it to be one or the other? Well, nothing. That's why in medieval thought, angelology, angels as purely spiritual beings are always considered to be neither male nor female. Angels don't have sex. That doesn't mean they don't have fun, but just, you know, they don't have sex. The claim then that I am a woman in a man's body or a man in a woman's body is either incoherent or at best analogical. If a boy likes stereotypically girls' toys and activities, does that make him a girl in a boy's body? If a girl likes stereotypically boys' toys and activities, does that make her a boy in a girl's body? What of Georgina in Eden Blyton's famous 5 stories, who wants to be called George and to be treated like a boy? Is she a boy in a girl's body, or is she rather a girl who resents and resists the narrow limits of what is presented to her as the acceptable range of female experience and interest? Someone, in a word, who doesn't want to be stereotyped. The ironic paradox of transgender ideology is that it reinforces the very gender stereotypes that other parts of the liberal agenda are industriously trying to erase. For once, I'm on the side of the angels here, the liberal angels, that is. Until very recently, the view of humanity in the mass was that our sex was understood to be an intrinsic part of our being. It could be known, apart from very rare cases of problematic embryonic development, from an inspection of our bodily structures. Human sexuality is intrinsically oriented towards procreation, and our bodily structures indicate our roles in that process. The desire to change our sex is at root a desire to be another person, and implicitly a desire to cease to be who you are and what you are. According to the new transgender orthodoxy, you are what you feel yourself to be. So that if you're a man and feel yourself to be a woman, then that's what you are, or vice versa. The body as accidental, again, you see where this fits in with position 1, as accidental to what I really am, can be molded to reflect the superior reality of what my feelings reveal me to really be. Although if my body is really contingent, it's difficult to see how either being a man or woman is really me at all. So let's return to the basic question at the bottom of all these ruminations. In other words, what are we? Are we just lumps of living matter? What is this thing, if it is a thing, that asks these kind of questions? Am I just my body? And if not, is there something else that I am? Am I a self that's only contingently connected to the body, a la Plato? Or is myself, if it is anything, just an aspect, a dimension of my body, as it might seem to be in an accidental self for position number 3? Although, as we see, they can't coherently hold to any conception of self at all. Putting it on the line, for me, human beings are not indeterminate lumps of flesh that can be transformed either into other beings or into other sexes. Transgenderism is the radical claim that not only can one choose to mirror the sexual identity of a person of the other sex, which one can do, of course, but one can assume it in reality. Look, I have no wish to be harsh, okay, and people suffering from gender dysphoria need compassion and treatment, but the only way to describe the transgenderist doctrine is as a delusion. Okay. The weirdness of the world in which we live is that those who point out this delusion are the ones who are attacked and accused of manifesting a psychologically disturbed condition called transphobia, right? Which is really kind of strange. So in saying what I've just said, I would be accused of being transphobic, and I'm going, I don't even understand what that means. Okay, it's like phobia is an irrational fear of hatred of something, and I have no fear or hatred of anybody, whatever their beliefs, however strange they might be. Certainly not an irrational fear of them. It's quite strange. So the person who, the man who thinks he's a woman or the woman who thinks he's a man is just fine. That's all right. So I'm the one with the delusions. I'm the one with the mental problem here. Right? Okay. I may have mental problems. Ask my wife about that. She'll tell you, right? But so that doesn't seem to be one of them. The attacks come via efforts to blacklist businesses owned by such reactionaries, or pressure put on people's employers to fire them, or even of efforts to use or make laws that force them to recant or else. See, this is serious, because this is not just like some intellectual debate. This is actually now embodied in law. We have a 2015 Gender Recognition Act. The conclusion of which, by the way, is not that you can change your gender, whatever that is, but that you can change your sex, which is quite striking. We now have hate laws coming down the pike, and one of the protected characteristics is going to be gender identity. Okay? Next year, if I were to give this talk, I could find myself up on a criminal charge of hate speech. Ooh, do I care? As they say on the TV, am I bothered? No, right? Anyway, the efflorescence okay, of what in 2020 has come to be called cancel culture is merely the latest expression of this targeted hostility. Worrying as these informal methods of intimidation are, even more worrying are that the right to freedom of speech is increasingly being circumscribed by hateful laws prohibiting what is deemed to be hate speech. Excuse me, hate speech. I just mentioned that. Anyway, Orthodox Christianity speaks of the soul, because I can see where objections might come on this, so let me just see if I can anticipate some. And it would be understandable if we were to think that it subscribes to a radical body-soul dualism. But it doesn't. And this was one area in which the struggle of early Christianity with those who would turn it in a Gnostic direction was of vital importance. For Gnosticism, what I am, again, is a kind of Platonic position. What I am is essentially myself or my soul, and the body is irrelevant. Some forms of Gnosticism regard the body as a prison in which the soul is held captive, so that our ultimate goal is liberation from it. So very much like the Hindu position. In fact, there's a neat expression in Greek, soma sema, the body prison. Boom, boom. Okay. The body is a tomb, rather. The body not being me, not being what I am, can be treated in any way that suits. One might be tempted to think that Gnosticism is a matter of interest only for historians of the early church, but Gnosticism hasn't gone away. None of this is the great thing about philosophy. Okay, these things, like you might say, well, it's of historical interest, and of course it is. But these kinds of questions permeate our culture, and they come up again in slightly different forms through the ages, and they require new answers, as it were, or new treatments. Gnosticism has never completely disappeared, and it's an ever-present intellectual temptation. It must be admitted that some popular forms of Christianity sailed close to the Gnostic wind in tacitly supporting some form or other of radical ontological dualism. I know many religious believers who are de facto dualists. It's unorthodox, they shouldn't be, okay, but they are. Just as I think I would estimate about 95% of Irish Catholics are actually Pelagians, but leave that to one side, that's a topic for another day. Okay. Not sufficient of the fights I'm about to start on this topic. Okay. Could we have slide 27, please? The preeminent Christian theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas writes in his commentary on St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, the human soul is part of the human body, but it is not the whole human being. I am not my soul. Anima mea non est ego. I am not my soul. This is not some lunatic theologian, okay, out on the fringe. This is the theologian at the heart and core of Catholic thought, telling us this. So even though it's accepted that the soul may continue to exist, he says, in another life, it is not I, nor any other man. The Princeton philosopher Robert George explains that transgender ideology is Gnostic in its denial of physical reality in favor of an allegedly overruling knowledge in association with feelings. And just to take the heat off the Catholic Church here, let me mention that in a letter to the editor of the Times in London, N.T. Wright, the eminent theologian and former Anglican Bishop of Durham, wrote, the confusion about gender identity is a modern and now internet-fueled form of the ancient philosophy of Gnosticism. The Gnostic one who knows has discovered the secret of who I really am behind the deceptively outward appearance. This involves denying the goodness or even the ultimate reality of the natural world. Nature, however, tends to strike back, with the unlikely victims in this case being vulnerable and impressionable youngsters who, as confused adults, especially if they've undergone surgery, not to mention hormonal treatment, will pay the price for their elders' fashionable fantasies. So much for right. I'm getting there. Okay, take a deep breath for the last topic. So transgender is one topic, okay, where all of this ancient ways of thinking, if you like, have relevance still. So let me now talk, slide 28, please. Frankenstein's new monster. Okay, Kevin adverted to this morning. Transhumanism. Welcome to the wonderful world of transhumanism, which is crudely the ambition to combine machines and human beings. This is not the work of an isolated, half-crazy Dr. Frankenstein locked up in a castle somewhere in Central Europe, but a project that has the support of many of the great and the good who see it as giving a helping hand to the evolution of man. Particularly supportive of this project is the World Economic Forum. I'm not making this up. This is not a conspiracy. There's the link. Go look it up. It's right out there in front. You can look it up for yourself. Slide 29, please. The central premise of transhumanism is that biological evolution will eventually be overtaken by advances in genetic, wearable, and implantable technologies that artificially expedite the evolutionary process. Transhumanism itself is just part of a larger project described by the World Economic Forum as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Slide 30, please. About which they say, these advances are merging the physical, digital, and biological worlds in ways that create both huge promise, and for once telling the truth, and potential peril. The speed, breadth, and depth of this revolution is forcing us to rethink how countries develop, how organizations create value, and even what it means to be human. Even what it means to be human. I don't know about you. That scares the hell out of me. If you're not worried about this, you should be. Okay. One way in which this change might be made manifest is to end our reliance on that lump of fragile flesh we call our bodies. Slide 31, please. Some distinguished scientists, this is again a quote, such as Hans Moravec and Raymond Kurzweil, even advocate a post-human condition, the end of humanity's reliance of our congenital bodies by transforming, quote, our frail version 1.0 human bodies, in case you don't realize that's you, okay, this stuff here, right, into a far more durable and capable version 2.0 counterpart. Though transhumanism is sometimes something that has become realizable only relatively recently, the ideas and aspirations behind it go back quite some way. William Godwin, who was the poet Percy Shelley's father-in-law and an immensely influential writer and thinker in his own day, entertained the possibility of earthly immortality in his novel Saint Leon at the end of the 18th century. And in case you don't remember it, William Godwin's daughter was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, or Frankenstein, if you've seen the Mel Brooks movie. How do we get from body 1.0 to body 2.0? And here again, you begin to see the relevance of what I was talking about earlier. We do it by loading our minds into more reliable and more durable containers. That is, into machines. See, what you really are on this view is your mind, okay? And if only we could get rid of this stupid body, or these vile bodies, as the old Anglican service used to refer to it in the burial thing, okay? Get rid of it, we could live forever, because we could live in the machine, as it were, like a program in a computer. It's easy to see, for those of this persuasion, the mind is akin to a computer program or software running on a biological brain, and all we have to do is transfer the program from wetware, that's your brain, whoops, I think that's God telling me something, like maybe to stop talking. Anyway, running on onto a machine. The assumption of the mind program is that the mind program is a person, as distinct from the body, has struck some commentators, wait for it, as a kind of neo-Gnosticism. Really? Why would they think that? Okay. You won't perhaps be surprised to learn that the Catholic Church takes a dim view of attempts to create superhuman beings, but not all religious thinkers are of that way of thinking. Some believing that we have an obligation as co-creators to do whatever we can to improve and transcend the limits of human biology. Slide 32, please. If the humanist project were to proceed, would it lead to the creation, there's all sorts of interesting speculations here. One is, would it lead to the creation of two classes of human beings? The new genetically and mechanically and electronically improved version, and the old stuck-in-the-mud versions, namely you and me, somewhat like H.G. Wells' ELOI and MORLOCKS. So where does all this leave us? Perhaps more confused than when we started. Well, great, that's my job. That's what I do as a philosopher. I did say that these topics were controversial, and the positions that people take were controverted. And this is not only true, but is likely to remain true for the foreseeable future. If I haven't answered all, or indeed any of the questions you might have, I hope I've given you something to think about. Let me leave you with one last question. Slide 33, please. Why can't zombies play the blues? Next slide, please. Because they ain't got no soul.